What happens when desperation, loss, and fate collide on the unforgiving frontier? A mother's love, a warrior's honor, and the path of destiny intertwine in ways no one could have imagined. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Arizona Territory, 1876. Margaret Wilson stood at the edge of her small homestead, her weary eyes scanning the barren landscape. At 35, her once youthful features had been weathered by the harsh sun and harsher life of the frontier. 3 years a widow, she had struggled to maintain the modest ranch her husband James had established before a band of raiders took his life. "Mary, Elizabeth," she called out, her voice carrying across the dusty yard. Her daughters, 10 and 8, emerged from behind the chicken coop, their dresses stained with dirt and their blonde hair tangled from play. "Girls, I need you to stay close to the house today," Margaret warned, her brow furrowing with concern. "Mr. Peterson from the general store says there've been Apache sightings near Willow Creek." "But Ma, we were going to pick berries by the stream," Mary protested, her blue eyes wide with disappointment. Margaret shook her head firmly. "Not today. The tensions between settlers and the Apache have been growing worse. Colonel Barrett's men stirred up trouble last month when they attacked that peaceful camp." She sighed, turning toward their small cabin. "Besides, we need to conserve our strength. Food's getting scarce, and I don't know when the next supply wagon will come through." Inside their modest home, Margaret surveyed their dwindling provisions. A small sack of flour, a few potatoes, and dried beans wouldn't last the week. The drought had withered their garden, and game had become increasingly difficult to find. She thought of her neighbors, the Hendersons, who had abandoned their homestead last month after nearly starving. As night fell, Margaret tucked her daughters into the small bed they shared. "Ma, tell us about Philadelphia again," Elizabeth whispered, her small hand clutching her mother's worn sleeve. Margaret smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her youngest daughter's forehead. "It's a grand city, with streets so wide 10 wagons could ride side by side. There are shops with windows full of colorful dresses and sweet treats. And in the parks, trees grow so tall they seem to touch the clouds." "Will we ever go there?" Mary asked, her voice heavy with sleep. "Perhaps someday," Margaret replied softly, though she knew their meager savings would never afford such a journey. "Your father always dreamed of taking us there." Later, as her daughters slept, Margaret sat at the rough-hewn table, mending clothes by the dim light of a tallow candle. The sound of coyotes echoed in the distance, a haunting melody that had become the soundtrack to her lonely evenings. "James," she whispered to the empty room, "I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The weight of solitude pressed down upon her shoulders. No neighbors for miles, no husband to share the burden, and 2 young daughters depending on her strength. A sudden noise outside startled her from her melancholy. Margaret reached for the shotgun James had taught her to use, her heart pounding against her ribs. She moved cautiously to the window, peering into the darkness. Nothing moved in the moonlit yard, but her instincts told her something wasn't right. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams haunted by shadowy figures and the remembered sound of James's voice calling her name across an endless desert. Dawn broke with an unusual stillness. Margaret rose early, as was her custom, and moved to wake the girls for their morning chores. The small bed was empty, the blanket tossed aside. "Mary? Elizabeth?" she called, expecting to hear their giggles from the kitchen. Silence answered. Margaret rushed outside, her nightdress billowing in the morning breeze. "Mary! Elizabeth!" Her cries grew more frantic as she searched the chicken coop, the small barn, the root cellar. No sign of her daughters. Then she saw it. Footprints in the dust. Small children's prints, leading away from the house toward Willow Creek, and alongside them, larger moccasined feet. Margaret's blood turned to ice. "No," she gasped, falling to her knees beside the tracks. "Please, God, no." She rushed back inside, dressing hurriedly and grabbing the shotgun and a small pack of provisions. There was no time to ride to the nearest settlement for help. By then, her daughters could be miles away. She would have to track them herself. As Margaret set off following the trail, determination hardened her features. She had already lost her husband to the wilderness. She would not lose her daughters too. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, as Margaret followed the tracks westward, toward the mountains where the Apache were said to make their camps. Her water supply dwindled quickly in the merciless heat, and hunger gnawed at her empty stomach. But fear for her children drove her forward, one foot before the other, across terrain that seemed designed to break the human spirit. "I'm coming for you," she whispered, her parched lips cracking as she spoke the promise aloud. "Hold on, my darlings. Mother's coming." The mountains loomed before Margaret like ancient guardians, indifferent to her plight. 2 days had passed since she'd left the homestead, following the tracks that sometimes disappeared on rocky ground, only to reappear in patches of soft earth. Her water was gone, and she had resorted to chewing on cactus flesh to ease her thirst. As the sun began to set on the second day, Margaret stumbled, her exhausted legs finally giving way. She fell hard onto the packed dirt, the shotgun clattering beside her. For a moment, she lay there, allowing despair to wash over her. "I can't fail them," she murmured, forcing herself back to her feet. As she rose, she noticed a thin plume of smoke rising from a sheltered canyon ahead. Her heart raced. It could be an Apache camp. Margaret approached cautiously, using the growing darkness as cover. The terrain was treacherous with loose stones that threatened to announce her presence with every step. As she neared the canyon's edge, voices drifted upward. Not the Apache language she had expected, but English, with the distinct drawl of the frontier. "Should fetch a good price from them Mexicans down south," a gruff voice said. "Young'uns like these are rare finds." Margaret's breath caught. Slavers, not Apache at all, but white men who preyed on isolated homesteads, taking children to sell across the border. She inched forward, peering over the canyon rim. Below, she could make out 4 men gathered around a campfire, rifles at their sides. And there, huddled together beneath a tattered blanket, were Mary and Elizabeth, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. Rage surged through Margaret's veins, giving her new strength. She considered her options. 4 armed men against 1 exhausted woman with a shotgun. The odds were impossible. As she withdrew to formulate a plan, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. Margaret struggled, but her captor held firm. "Be still," a deep voice commanded in her ear, "or they will hear you." The hand slowly released her, and Margaret turned to face a tall Apache warrior, his face painted for battle, dark eyes regarding her with wary curiosity. "Those are my daughters," Margaret whispered, gesturing toward the camp below. The warrior nodded once. "I know. I have been tracking these men for 2 days. They attacked a hunting party, killed 2 of my brothers. You're going to rescue my girls?" Hope flickered in Margaret's chest. "I am going to avenge my people," he replied flatly. "If your daughters survive, you may take them." Margaret gripped his arm, desperation evident in her voice. "Please, they're innocent children. Promise me you'll protect them." The warrior studied her face for a long moment. "I am Na Kohei," he finally said. "It means warrior. What do they call you?" "Margaret. Margaret Wilson. The men who took your daughters also took something from me, my younger brother's life." Na Kohei's expression remained stoic, but Margaret detected a flash of pain in his eyes. He was only 16 summers. "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. "I've lost someone too, my husband." A moment of understanding passed between them, bridging the vast divide of their different worlds. "There are 4 of them," Na Kohei stated, "armed. I cannot promise your daughter's safety if we attack directly." Margaret thought quickly. What if we created a diversion? Draw them away from the girls? Na Kohei considered her words. "You know how to use that?" He nodded toward the shotgun. "My husband taught me." "Good." For the first time, a hint of approval crossed his face. "Then we will work together, Margaret Wilson." As night fully descended, they formulated their plan. Margaret would create a distraction on the far side of the canyon, while Na Kohei would move in to free the girls. It was simple but dangerous. A single misstep could cost all their lives. "If I don't survive," Margaret whispered, "tell my daughters I love them." "You will tell them yourself," Na Kohei replied with quiet confidence. They moved into position, Margaret circling wide to approach the camp from the opposite side. She found a loose boulder and, summoning all her strength, pushed it over the edge of the canyon. The resulting crash echoed through the night, followed by shouts of alarm from the camp. "Check it out!" one of the men commanded. Could be Apache. Two of the slavers grabbed their rifles and headed toward the sound. Margaret waited until they were close, then fired her shotgun into the air before quickly changing position. There she is! Get her! Gunshots rang out as Margaret darted between rocks, drawing the men further from camp. She fired again, her hands shaking with fear and determination. Meanwhile, Nakohe slipped into the camp like a shadow. The remaining two men had taken up defensive positions, their attention focused on the gunfire. He moved silently behind the first, a quick slash of his knife ending the man's life before he could cry out. The second turned just in time to see Nakohe's tomahawk descending. Mary and Elizabeth cowered beneath their blanket, terrified by the violence around them. Nakohe knelt before them, speaking in soft tones. "Your mother sent me. Come quickly." The girls hesitated, frightened by his appearance. The older one, Mary, finally stood. "You know our ma?" "Yes, she fights for you now. We must hurry." Elizabeth began to cry. "I want my mama." "Shh," Mary soothed her sister. "We gotta be brave, like Pa always said." Nakohe lifted Elizabeth in one arm, took Mary's hand with his free hand, and led them swiftly away from the camp, heading toward a prearranged meeting point. Margaret continued to evade the two pursuing men, but her strength was failing. A bullet grazed her arm, and she stumbled, falling hard onto the rocky ground. Footsteps approached, and she braced herself for the end. Suddenly, a war cry split the night. Nakohe appeared like a vengeful spirit, launching himself at the nearest slaver. The man had no time to raise his weapon before Nakohe's knife found its mark. The second man fired wildly, missing in his panic. Margaret raised her shotgun with trembling hands and pulled the trigger. The blast knocked the man backward, and he lay still. Silence descended on the canyon. "Margaret Wilson," Nakohe called. "It is finished." She struggled to her feet, clutching her wounded arm. "My daughters. Safe. They wait for you." Margaret followed Nakohe to a sheltered overhang where Mary and Elizabeth huddled together. At the sight of their mother, they burst into tears, running to embrace her. "Mama! We were so scared." Elizabeth sobbed against Margaret's skirt. "Shh, I'm here now," Margaret soothed, holding them close, her own tears flowing freely. "You're safe. Everything will be all right." Over the girls' heads, her eyes met Nakohe's. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then turned to leave. "Wait," Margaret called. "Where will you go?" "To my people," he replied simply. "Our paths separate here." Margaret hesitated, then said, "We have nothing at the homestead. No food, little water. We won't survive long." Nakohe considered her words. "The journey to my camp is difficult. My people are wary of white faces. We have nowhere else to go," Margaret admitted. The truth of their desperate situation hung in the air between them. After a long moment, Nakohe spoke. "Then you will come with me, until you are strong enough to return to your own kind." As dawn broke over the canyon, the unlikely group began their journey into the mountains, toward an uncertain future in the Apache camp. The journey to the Apache camp took 3 days through rugged mountain terrain. Margaret's arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, but Nakohe had dressed the wound with herbs that dulled the pain. Mary and Elizabeth, initially frightened of their stoic guide, had gradually warmed to him, especially after he fashioned small dolls from corn husks for them during their evening rest. "Why do you have those marks on your face?" Elizabeth asked him on the second night, her childish curiosity overcoming her shyness. "They tell the story of who I am," Nakohe explained, his usually stern expression softening slightly. "This one shows I am of the Black Mountain Band. This one that I am a warrior who has earned respect." Mary leaned forward, fascinated. "Did it hurt to put them there?" A rare smile crossed his face. "Yes, but pain teaches strength." Margaret watched this exchange with mixed emotions. She had been raised on stories of Apache savagery, yet this man had saved her daughters at great risk to himself. The contradictions troubled her deeply. "Your people," she ventured later, when the girls had fallen asleep. "Will they accept us?" Nakohe stared into the small fire. "Our chief, Naiche, is wise. He knows not all white people carry hatred in their hearts, but others will be suspicious." He looked directly at Margaret. "You must show respect for our ways. Can you do this?" Margaret nodded solemnly. I can, and I'll teach my daughters to do the same. As they approached the Apache camp on the third day, Margaret felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Smoke from several fires rose above a cluster of wickiups nestled in a hidden valley. Children played among the dwellings, women worked at cooking fires, and warriors stood guard at strategic points. Activity ceased as Nakohe led the white woman and her daughters into camp. Wary eyes followed their progress, and whispers spread rapidly through the gathered people. An elderly man emerged from the largest wickiup, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the newcomers. Margaret recognized the air of authority about him immediately. Nakohe stepped forward and spoke in Apache, gesturing occasionally toward Margaret and the girls. The chief, Naiche, listened without interruption, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Nakohe finished, Naiche approached Margaret. "My warrior tells me you fought bravely for your children," he said, in surprisingly good English. "That you respected our ways by not shooting the men who took them, allowing him to avenge his brother's death instead." Margaret glanced at Nakohe, realizing he had altered the story to cast her in a better light. "Your warrior saved my daughters when I could not," she replied honestly. "I owe him a debt I can never repay." Naiche considered her words. "Among our people, debts must be balanced. You will work alongside our women, contributing to our camp while you stay." He turned to Nakohe. "She and her children are your responsibility. Teach them our ways, keep them from harm." Nakohe accepted this duty with a solemn nod. An older woman approached, her face lined with years but her eyes kind. "Come," she said to Margaret and the girls. "You need food and rest." The woman, who introduced herself as Istas, meaning snow, led them to a small wickiup at the edge of camp. Inside, she provided them with clean blankets and a simple meal of stew. Margaret thanked her profusely, but Istas waved away her gratitude. "Nakohe is my sister's son," she explained. "He sees something in you worth protecting. That is enough for me." In the days that followed, Margaret and her daughters adapted to life among the Apache. Mary and Elizabeth quickly made friends with the camp children, learning their games and picking up words of their language. Margaret worked alongside the women, learning to prepare foods, tan hides, and weave baskets. The work was hard but satisfying, and the steady meals restored strength to her thin frame. Nakohe came and went, often absent for days while hunting or scouting. But when in camp, he spent time with Margaret and her daughters, teaching them survival skills and telling stories of Apache history. Margaret found herself looking forward to these times, studying his face as he spoke, noticing the intelligence in his eyes and the rare smiles that transformed his stern features. "Why did you become a warrior?" she asked him one evening as they sat outside her wickiup, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. Nakohe was silent for so long that Margaret thought he would not answer. Finally, he spoke. "When I was 12, white soldiers attacked our camp while the men were hunting. They killed many, including my mother." His voice remained steady, but Margaret saw his hands clench. "I swore to protect my people from that day forward." Margaret's heart ached at his words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Your people have taken much from mine," he said, looking directly at her. "Land, lives, freedom to roam as we always have. Not all white people wish harm to the Apache." Margaret replied softly. "No, some like you have good hearts." He paused. "But it changes nothing. The soldiers will come again and again until we are gone or broken." The truth of his words hung between them, impossible to deny. As weeks passed, Margaret noticed changes in herself. Her skin darkened under the sun, her hands grew calloused from work, and her body became stronger than it had been since her youth. But more significant were the changes within. She found herself viewing the world through different eyes, questioning beliefs she had never before examined. The Apache women, initially distant, gradually accepted her into their circle. She learned that they wielded considerable influence in the tribe, their opinions valued by the men in ways that would shock most white settlers. Their laughter, wisdom, and strength reminded her of the community of women she had left behind in the East when she followed James westward. One afternoon, as Margaret worked alongside Istas, grinding corn for flour, the older woman spoke unexpectedly. "Nakohe watches you when you are not looking." Margaret's hands faltered in their rhythm. I'm sure he's just fulfilling his duty to keep us safe. Ista smiled knowingly. My nephew has never looked at any woman as he looks at you. She resumed her grinding. It troubles some in the camp. They say no good can come of it. There is nothing between us, Margaret protested, though her quickened heartbeat betrayed her. Not yet, Istas replied simply. But the wind changes direction, and wise travelers adjust their path accordingly. That evening, Margaret sat alone outside her wickiup, her thoughts in turmoil. Her daughters had integrated into camp life with the adaptability of children, but what future could they have here? And what of her own confused feelings for Nakohe? She was a white widow with 2 children. He was an Apache warrior whose people were fighting for survival against her own kind. Your thoughts travel far tonight, Nakohe's voice interrupted her reverie. He sat beside her, offering a small wooden bowl filled with pine nuts. Margaret accepted the gift, their fingers brushing briefly. I was thinking about the future. We cannot stay here forever. Why not? He asked, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. You know why, Margaret replied softly. I don't belong here. Where do you belong then? At your empty homestead? Slowly starving? His voice held no judgment, only honest inquiry. Margaret had no answer. The life she had known, the life she thought she should want to return to, seemed increasingly distant, like a faded photograph of someone else's existence. My people have a saying, Nakohe continued when she remained silent. The path of life is not straight. It winds through hills and valleys, sometimes leading us to places we never expected to find. Margaret looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they sat, how the firelight played across his strong features. And where has your path led you, Nakohe? His dark eyes held hers. To you, Margaret Wilson, though I never thought to find myself here. Before she could respond, shouts erupted from the far side of camp. Nakohe was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Stay here, he commanded, then strode rapidly toward the commotion. Margaret hesitated only briefly before following, fear clutching at her heart. As she reached the center of camp, she saw the cause of the disturbance. A young Apache warrior had returned, wounded and exhausted, carrying news that chilled her blood. Soldiers, Nakohe translated grimly for her benefit. A large patrol moving this way. They will reach the valley by morning. The camp erupted into activity, women gathering essentials while men prepared weapons. Margaret stood frozen, suddenly caught between 2 worlds, the one she had come from and the one that had given her shelter. Naishe approached her, his expression grave. You have a choice to make, woman. When the soldiers come, they will find you and your daughters here among us. What will you tell them? The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Would she betray these people who had taken her in for the sake of her own safety? Or would she stand with them against the approaching storm? Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that belied the tension gripping the Apache camp. Throughout the night, preparations had continued. Essential supplies packed, horses readied, children and elders gathered in the center of the camp. Margaret had made her decision well before first light. After ensuring Mary and Elizabeth were safely with Istas, she had sought out Nakohe, finding him conferring with other warriors at the edge of camp. I want to help, she said simply. Nakohe studied her face in the firelight, searching for any sign of hesitation. The soldiers are your people, he reminded her. No, Margaret replied firmly. My people are those who have shown me kindness and respect, who protected my daughters when they were in danger. She paused, gathering her courage. My people are here. Something shifted in Nakohe's expression, a softening around his eyes, a barely perceptible release of tension in his shoulders. Then we will fight together. Chief Naiche had accepted Margaret's offer with solemn appreciation, quickly incorporating her into their plans. Her knowledge of white military tactics, gleaned from her late husband's stories and her own observations of frontier outposts, proved unexpectedly valuable. They will expect us to flee deeper into the mountains, she explained to the gathered warriors, but they'll have scouts watching those trails. What do you suggest? Naiche asked. Margaret indicated a point on the rough map they had sketched in the dirt. There's a canyon here with steep walls but a passable floor. The soldiers will avoid it. Too easy for an ambush. If most of the camp travels through there, while warriors create a diversion elsewhere, you could reach the high desert by nightfall. The plan was approved, with modifications from Nakohe and other experienced warriors. Margaret would accompany the main group through the canyon, guiding them along a route she had traveled with James years earlier. As the sky lightened, scouts reported the soldiers' approach, a company of cavalry moving steadily toward the valley. "It is time," Nietzsche announced. Families embraced warriors who would stay behind to create the diversion. Margaret watched as Nakohe knelt before Mary and Elizabeth. "Be brave," he told them, adjusting the small medicine pouches he had made for each girl. "Listen to your mother and Istas. I will find you when it is safe." Elizabeth threw her arms around his neck. "Promise you'll come back?" A shadow passed over Nakohe's face, but he nodded. "I promise to try, little one." He rose and turned to Margaret. For a moment they stood facing each other, words unnecessary between them. Then, with unexpected gentleness, he placed his hand against her cheek. "Until we meet again, Margaret Wilson." She covered his hand with her own. "I'll be waiting, Nakohe." The main group departed quickly and quietly, a long line of women, children, and elders with essential belongings loaded onto travois pulled by horses. Margaret walked beside Istas, who carried Elizabeth when the child grew tired. Mary stayed close to her mother's side, her young face solemn with understanding beyond her years. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when the sounds of distant gunfire echoed across the valley behind them. Margaret's heart clenched, her thoughts with Nakohe and the warriors creating the diversion that would allow their escape. "He is skilled," Istas said, noting Margaret's expression. "And he has much to live for now." They pressed on through the narrow canyon, the walls rising high on either side, offering protection, but also creating a sense of vulnerability. If soldiers discovered their route and positioned themselves at either end, they would be trapped. By midday, they had covered considerable ground. Nietzsche called a brief halt to rest the children and horses. Margaret took the opportunity to climb to a high point, scanning their back trail for any sign of pursuit. What she saw made her blood run cold. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the movement of mounted men, not on the main trail where the diversion had been planned, but cutting directly toward the canyon entrance. "They've found us," she reported breathlessly to Nietzsche. "Cavalry, moving fast. They'll reach the canyon entrance within the hour." The chief's face remained impassive, but alarm flashed in his eyes. "We cannot outrun horses in this terrain," Margaret thought quickly. "There's a side canyon about a mile ahead that James once showed me. It's narrow and hidden. The soldiers might pass by without noticing it." "And if they do not pass by?" Nietzsche challenged. "Then we make our stand there, where the passage is too narrow for them to use their numbers effectively." Nietzsche nodded. "Lead us." The group increased their pace, parents carrying exhausted children, elders pushing beyond their limits. Margaret took Elizabeth from Istas, ignoring the burn in her muscles as she carried her daughter while urging Mary to keep up. They reached the side canyon just as the sounds of pursuit grew audible, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats, the occasional shout of command. The entrance was, as Margaret remembered, easily missed unless one knew exactly where to look, a narrow fissure in the rock wall that widened into a twisting passage. "Hurry," she urged, helping people through the opening. "Stay quiet. Move as far back as possible." The last of the group had barely cleared the entrance when the first soldiers appeared at the far end of the main canyon. Margaret pressed herself against the rock wall, holding her breath as a scout rode slowly past their hiding place, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. For one heart-stopping moment, the soldier paused, his gaze seeming to fix directly on the fissure. Margaret's hand moved to the knife Nakohe had given her, knowing it would be futile against the soldier's rifle, but unwilling to be taken without a fight. A shout from further down the canyon drew the scout's attention. He urged his horse forward, continuing his patrol. Margaret released her breath slowly, offering silent thanks to whatever providence had diverted the man's attention. They remained hidden as the main body of soldiers passed, the sounds of their passage gradually fading, as they continued up the canyon, following the false trail Nakohe and the others had laid. Night fell, bringing a bone-deep cold to the narrow passage. The children huddled together for warmth while adults took turns watching the entrance. Margaret found herself unable to sleep, her mind filled with worries about Nakohe and the other warriors. about their uncertain future, about the dangers that still lay ahead. Istas settled beside her, offering a small piece of pemmican. You should eat. Tomorrow will require strength. What if they didn't make it, Istas? Margaret whispered. Nakohe and the others? The older woman's weathered face remained serene. My nephew walks with powerful spirits. If anyone survived, it would be him. She patted Margaret's hand. Besides, he has something important to return for now. Before Margaret could respond, a soft whistle came from the canyon entrance. 3 notes in a pattern she recognized from camp. One of the warriors on watch answered with a similar signal. Moments later, shadowy figures slipped into their hiding place. Margaret strained to see in the darkness, her heart pounding with hope and fear. Then a familiar voice spoke her name. Margaret. She was on her feet instantly, moving toward the sound. Nakohe stood there, his clothing torn and bloodied, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders, but alive. You came back, she whispered, fighting the urge to throw herself into his arms. I promised, he replied simply. Only 5 warriors had returned from the diversion, Nakohe reported to Naiche. They had led the soldiers on a long chase, splitting up to confuse their pursuers. Some had certainly been captured or killed, but they had succeeded in their mission, buying time for the main group to escape. The soldiers have established a camp at the canyon entrance, Nakohe continued. They believe they have us trapped, but they do not know of this passage. Naiche nodded thoughtfully. We will rest tonight and continue at first light. There is a path through the mountains beyond this place that will take us to our winter grounds. The soldiers will not follow us there. As the others settled to rest, Nakohe drew Margaret aside. Walk with me, he requested. They moved deeper into the passage where a small opening in the rock ceiling allowed moonlight to filter through, casting a silver glow on the stone walls. I thought of you, Nakohe said quietly. When the bullets were flying and death seemed certain, I thought of your face, and it gave me strength to continue. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. I was so afraid you wouldn't return. There was a time when I would have welcomed death in battle, he admitted. It is the warrior's greatest honor among my people. But now, he took her hands in his. Now I find I have reasons to live. Margaret looked up at him, seeing in his eyes the same emotions that had been growing in her own heart. What happens now, Nakohe? When we reach the winter grounds? That depends on you, he replied. My people will accept you and your daughters. You have proven yourselves worthy of a place among us, but I would not ask you to give up your world entirely. My world gave me nothing but hardship and loneliness, Margaret said softly. Here among your people, my daughters have found happiness, and I, she hesitated, then continued with newfound certainty. I have found where I belong. Nakohe's expression remained serious. The path will not be easy. There will always be those from both our worlds who disapprove. I'm not afraid, Margaret assured him. Not anymore. In the silver moonlight, their worlds finally merged as Nakohe drew her into his embrace. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the passion of 2 souls who had found in each other an unexpected sanctuary. 2 days later, the group emerged from the mountains into the high desert beyond. No signs of pursuit had been detected since they left the hidden canyon. As they established a temporary camp, Margaret stood with Nakohe, watching Mary and Elizabeth playing with the Apache children, their laughter carrying on the clear desert air. They belong here, Margaret observed, more than they ever did at the homestead. And you? Nakohe asked, his arm around her waist. Margaret leaned against him, feeling the steady strength that had become her anchor in a world of uncertainty. I belong wherever you are, she replied simply. That evening, as the camp celebrated their escape with a modest feast and traditional songs, Chief Naiche called Margaret and Nakohe before the assembled people. The spirits work in ways we cannot always understand, the elderly leader proclaimed. They have brought these different paths together for a purpose. He looked at Margaret and her daughters. You came to us as strangers, but you have proven yourselves to be Ndi, the people. You stood with us when you could have sought safety elsewhere. He turned to Nakohe. And you, my warrior, have found what many search for all their lives, a heart that beats in rhythm with your own. With solemn ceremony, Naiche blessed their union according to Apache tradition. Margaret, dressed in clothing Istas had made for her, felt a profound sense of rightness as she pledged herself to Nakohe beneath the vast desert sky. Later, as they sat together watching the stars appear one by one, Elizabeth and Mary sleeping nearby, Margaret reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. "When I left the homestead to find my daughters," she said softly, "I thought I was heading toward the end of everything. I never imagined I was actually finding a beginning." Nakohe smiled, the expression transforming his warrior's face. The Apache believed that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning. Like the desert after fire, what seems destroyed will bloom again, stronger than before. Margaret looked at her daughters, then at the man beside her. Against all odds, across seemingly insurmountable divides of culture and history, they had found each other. In the vast wilderness that had once filled her with fear, she had discovered not only survival but the profound gift of belonging. "Our path will not be easy," Nakohe reminded her, echoing his earlier words. Margaret nodded, but her eyes reflected the certainty in her heart. The most worthwhile paths rarely are. As the campfire burned low and the desert night embraced them in its ancient silence, Margaret Wilson, now known among the people by her Apache name Alope, Mockingbird, rested her head against her warrior's shoulder, finally at peace.